Keeper of the Lost Cities, Chapter 1 and Preface, by Shannon Messenger. Preface. We can't keep doing this. The words pulsed through Sophie's mind, gaining volume, gaining momentum, as the arguments raged around her. All the strategizing and analyzing and agonizing. It never worked. No matter how clever or careful their plans were, their enemies were always smarter, stronger, ready with some brutal, unexpected twist, leaving them stumbling and scrambling. We can't keep doing this. This time the words had a voice, and it took Sophie a second to realize they'd come from her, and she didn't regret them. It was time to try something new, time to take a stand, even if it risked everything. And maybe if they worked together and were really, really lucky, this would be their new legacy, saving Keith from his. You look confused, Mr. Forkel said, and the lift of his tone made Sophie wonder if his lips were twitching with a smile. But she couldn't pull her eyes away from the round, gilded door he'd brought her to, tucked into the side of a rolling, grassy hill. This place reminded her of a hobbit home, but Sophie had been living in the Lost Cities long enough to know better than to voice that observation. All it would earn her was laughter, or perhaps some impossible-to-believe story about how Mr. Forkel had once brought J.R.R. Tolkien there and provided him with inspiration. I thought you were taking me to your office, she told him, shifting her gaze towards the wind-blown meadow and searching the swaying wildflowers for clues as to where they were. I did. Sophie opened her mouth to argue, then realized what he meant. He had brought her to his office, not Magnet Leto's office at Foxfire like she'd been expecting, which was an easy mistake to make, considering the fact that Mr. Forkel and Magnet Leto were actually the same person, and Mr. Forkel was his much more enigmatic side. So this is your secret office, she clarified, feeling goosebumps prickling her skin at the thought. One of them, Mr. Forkel confirmed, winking as he shuffled his freckleberry-bloated body closer to the door. He leaned in and licked a spot on the left side of the door, which must have been a camouflage DNA sensor, because a rectangular panel slid open in the center, revealing 5 spinning, fist-sized cogs lined up in a neat row, 1 silver, 1 copper, 1 iron, 1 bronze, and 1 steel. Did Tankard design this place? Sophie asked, remembering the abundance of gleaming gear she'd seen decorating the walls of Widgetmore, as well as the technopath's clear fondness for the number 5. But that wasn't the question she should have been focusing on, so she quickly added, and why are we here? Mr. Forkel twisted the cogs one by one, entering some sort of complicated combination. You said we needed to talk. Isn't that why you requested this meeting? It is, but Sophie's words trailed off as the last cog clicked into place, making the ground rumble and the golden door sink into a slit that appeared in the damp earth. Cold air blasted her face from the dark room below, blowing strands of her blonde hair into her eyes as she took an eager step forward and "Stop!" A familiar squeaky voice shouted behind her. Sophie froze. She had learned that it was much easier to let the 7-foot-tall, heavily armed gray goblin lead the way, along with a hulking ogre warrior and a tiny green-toothed gnome. Sandor, Bo, and Flory were 3 of her 5 multi-special bodyguards, and they took their jobs very seriously. So did her other bodyguards, of course. But Nobiti kept watch from a position deep underground, since Dorf's eyes were highly sensitive to light. Tarina still hadn't been allowed to return to duty after what everyone was calling the scandal at Everglen. Though scandal wasn't a strong enough word. It didn't capture the shock that came with discovering an illegal troll hive hidden at the estate of one of their world's most prominent families. And it definitely didn't evoke the horror of the genetically altered, bloodthirsty trolls who went on a murderous rampage once the door to the hive was open. Both the elven and trollish worlds were still reeling from the disaster, since the Neverseen had managed to broadcast the nightmarish battle to everyone gathered for the celestial festival, and no one could agree on how to punish those who had been involved. A tribunal had already been held for Lucia Backer, but her sentence had yet to be finalized, and numerous additional investigations seemed to be endlessly ongoing. Foxfire, the Elves' most prestigious academy, had been put on an extended hiatus because parents were worried the school might be targeted. Plus, treaty negotiations still needed to be arranged because the Elven Council and the Trolls' supreme leader, but everyone was wary of another peace summit after what had happened at the last one. "This office is perfectly safe," Mr. Forkle assured Sophie's bodyguards. "Watchword Heath is protected by 5 different kinds of security, and only 6 people in the world know how to find it. Well, 7 now, given Miss Foster's knack for teleporting." "And the office should have no problem passing my investigation," Sandra called over his shoulder as he drew his massive curved sword and marched through the doorway, followed by Beau and Florrie. He'd always been overprotective, but his paranoia had reached new levels of exhaustion after the Neverseen's recent brutal attack, and Sophie couldn't blame him, since she and Fitz had ended up bedridden in the healing center for weeks. Her right hand still ached whenever she pushed herself too hard, and Fitz occasionally walked with a slight limp. But Elwyn kept assuring them that they'd make a full recovery. Certain wounds were just trickier than others, and theirs had been some of the worst, thanks to the creepy echoes caused by the exposure to Shadowflux. This rare 6th element was darkness in its purest form. Only the strongest shades could control it, and Shadowflux changed everything it touched. Shadowflux was also somehow so vital to whatever the Neverseen were planning that when their shade was killed at Everglen, Lady Gisela threatened Tam until he agreed to serve as Umber's replacement. Sophie and Keith had begged Tam not to go, but he swore he could handle himself, and Lady Gisela had warned them that any attempt to rescue would only put Tam and his sister Lynn in greater danger. So Tam was on his own with the Neverseen, and it killed Sophie every time she thought about it. Each passing week made her heart heavier, her nightmares more vivid, her brain more convinced that she'd never see her friend again. Or worse, that Tam would join the enemy for real. If you hear us out, I guarantee you'll realize that we are the only ones with an actual solution to the problems in this world, and that you've been wasting your talent serving the wrong side," Lady Gisela had told him. And she'd proven time and again that she was a master of mind games and manipulation. "All clear," Sandra called, and Sophie squared her shoulders and took a long, steadying breath. She could go back to worrying about Tam later. Right now, she needed to focus on the conversation ahead, a conversation she'd been rehearsing for the last 9 days. Ever since she'd gone to Atlantis, and, well, things had not gone according to plan. She could still see the pitying looks on the matchmaker's face as they showed her the ugly red words on the screen. Words that would define her, destroy her, if people found out about them. That was why she'd begged for this meeting. If she could convince Mr. Forkle to give her one tiny piece of information, something she deserved to know anyway, everything would get back on track. She'd been gearing up for a fight, since getting information from the Black Swan was a lot like prying open the jaws of a thrashing verminion. But if he trusted her enough to bring her his secret office, "Shall we?" Mr. Forkle asked, gesturing to the entrance. Sophie nodded and crossed the threshold, shivering as a blast of cold, metallic-tinged air seeped through the thin fabric of her lavender tunic. The room was too dark to see, but it felt like stepping into a refrigerator, and she pulled her dove-gray cape tighter around her shoulders, wishing she'd worn thicker gloves instead of the silk ones she'd chosen. The light flared to life when Mr. Forkle followed, as if the sensor only responded to him. "You don't look impressed," he noted, as Sophie blinked in the sudden brightness. "It's just not what I was expecting." She'd been imagining his secret office for years, and she'd always pictured a cross between a spaceship and Hogwarts, with fancy architecture and all kinds of high-tech gadgets and mysterious contraptions. Plus clues to who Mr. Forkle truly was, and plenty of hints about Project Moonlark. Instead, she'd found herself in a curved white room that made her feel like she was standing inside a giant underground egg. Soft light poured from a single bulb, which dangled off the end of a thin chain above a round silver table. The walls were smooth and bare, as was the floor, and several small grates in the ceiling flooded the room with icy drafts. That was it. No windows nor doors, except the one they'd come through, which had sealed silently behind them. Nowhere to sit, no decor of any kind, not even any books or scrolls, despite Mr. Forkle's love of research. "And here I thought you'd learn the things in the lost cities are rarely what they'd seen," Mr. Forkle said, pressing his palm against the wall. The light bulb flickered twice before it flared much brighter and projected a grid of images across every surface of the room, as if the office was tapping into thousands of camera feeds displaying elves, goblins, ogres, trolls, dwarves, gnomes, and humans going about their daily lives. Every few seconds the images shifted, making Sophie wonder whether she'd catch a glimpse of the entire planet if she stood there long enough. "Still nothing?" Mr. Forkle asked. She shrugged. "It's not that different from Quinlan's office in Atlantis, and I'm pretty sure a lot of human leaders have rooms like this too. Not showing all the other species, but you know what I mean." "Do I?" Mr. Forkle tapped the wall to make the images disappear before he placed his palm flat against the silver table. "What about this, then?" The metal surface rippled at his touch, stretching and splitting into a million thin wires that made it look like a giant version of one of those pin art toys Sophie used to play with as a kid. He tapped his fingers in a quick rhythm, and the pins shifted and sank, forming highs and lows and smooth, flat stretches. Sophie couldn't figure out what she was seeing until he tapped a few additional beats, and tiny pricks of light flared at the end of each wire, bathing the scene in vibrant colors and marking everything with glowing labels. "It's a map," she murmured, making a slow circle around the table. And not just any map, a 3D map of the lost cities. She'd never seen her world like that before, with everything spread out across the planet in relation to everything else. Eternalia, the elven capital that had likely inspired the human myths of Shangri-La, was much closer to the sanctuary than she realized, nestled into one of the valleys of the Himalayas, while the special animal preserve was hidden inside the hollowed-out mountains. Atlantis was deep under the Mediterranean Sea, just like the human legends describe, and it looked like the Mysterium was somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. The gateway to exile was in the middle of the Sahara Desert, though the prison itself was buried in the center of the earth. And Luminaria? Wait, Luminaria is Luminaria on one of the Channel Islands? She asked, trying to compare what she was seeing against the map she'd memorized in her human geography classes. Yes and no. It's technically part of the same archipelago, but we've kept the particular island hidden, so humans have no idea it exists. Well, beyond the convoluted stories we've occasionally leaked to cause some confusion. Huh. Luminaria had reminded her of Camelot when she'd been there, so that must be where some of the legends came from. The elves like to play with the lore of their world, leaving in conflicting fantastical details to make it to make it that much harder for humans to believe in it. She leaned closer, wondering how accurate the map's details were. She hadn't been to Luminaria since the collapse, and it looked like the glowing castle was now finally rebuilt, with much higher walls. A new tree also stood next to the Four Seasons tree, perhaps a memorial for those who died in the attack. And humans really haven't found this island. It's right by France and the United Kingdom, and boats go through that channel all the time. You've seen how powerful our illusions are, Mr. Forkle reminded her. Sophie's stomach soured. Vespera had designed most of the optical illusions that shielded the lost cities from detection. And out of all the Neverseens leaders, she was the most ruthless. She saw violence as a solution, and was always claiming that Sophie and Keith would never be ready. For what? They didn't know. But it seemed safe to assume that it had something to do with Keith's legacy. It helps to see our world this way, doesn't it? Mr. Forkle asked, moving to Sophie's side. I've been coming here a lot lately, to strategize. Does that mean you have a plan? She asked, even though she was pretty sure that she knew the answer. It's work in progress, he sighed when her hands curled into fists. I understand your impatience, Miss Foster, but some things cannot be rushed. Her laugh sounded as bitter as she felt. They'd been trying to take down the Neverseen for the entire time she'd been living in the Lost Cities. And here they were, years later, still with no clue what the Neverseen were up to or where they were hiding. She and her friends had been trying to figure out how to take their next move ever since Tam was taken. But all they had to go on were some worthless leads they'd wasted too much time on already. Fake caches, a missing starstone, way too much confusing symbols. The key to Lady Gisella's archetype, but not the book that the key opened. Tiny fragments of shattered memories that didn't make sense, and no matter what truths they pieced together or what risks they took, the Neverseen were always 5 million steps ahead of them. Put simply, they were losing. And Sophie was sick of it. The Neverseen had proven to be more formidable than we had expected, Mr. Forkle admitted. And their changes in leadership have made anticipating their tactics particularly complicated. We have too many enemies, Sophie muttered. We do indeed. And their individual visions do not always perfectly align, which has caused additional confusion. But we still know far more than you're letting yourself admit. Like what? She turned to face him, crossing her arms. I'm serious. Tell me one useful thing we've learned. I can name many, Miss Foster. And so can you. You're simply overlooking them because you're upset that you haven't gotten the answers you want. And I understand that inclination. But you're far too smart for such ill-reasoned logic, which is why I brought you here, to make sure you're seeing the bigger picture. He tapped another rhythm against the table, and the pins shifted, making new landmarks emerge among all others. Gildingham, Goblin's golden capital, which seemed to be tucked among the Andes Mountains, and probably inspired the human myths of El Dorado. Ravagog, the ogre's stronghold on the Aventine Tide River, which was apparently hidden in the luscious part of Central Asia. Lomnor, a city Sophie assumed was the Dwarven capital, since the enormous metropolis was under the Gobi Desert rather than above it. And Marantrila, an island near New Zealand, that was probably the trollish capital, and seemed to be an intricate network of caves and bridges. What do you see? Mr. Forkle asked. Sophie's eyes narrowed. I am assuming you're looking for a better answer than a bunch of cities. Florrie giggled. Sandor and Bo snorted. Mr. Forkle grumbled something under his breath that started with, You kids. Why don't you just tell me what you want me to say? Sophie suggested.
Because I'm trying to teach you, Miss Foster. Your friends look to you for guidance, and lately, all I've seen you display is despair and frustration. If you're going to lead them, you need to do better. Lead them. The phrase felt heavy on Sophie's tongue. Is that your big plan then? Dump all the responsibility on me because I'm the moonlark? Need I remind you that you're the one who chose to involve your friends? I'm not criticizing you for that. Your friends have proven invaluable to our efforts. But you can't ignore the responsibility that you took on when you recruited them. Sophie's insides twisted. She'd never intended to recruit her friends. That's the end of part 1 for Keeper of the Lost Cities Legacy, Chapter 1 by Shannon Messenger. Thank you for listening. Part 2 coming out soon. Thank you.